Close your eyes and let the world fade. You're standing at the edge of a sun-warmed stone terrace, the scent of lavender drifting in the breeze. In the distance, soft church bells echo through a valley dotted with olive groves and golden fields. The hum of cicadas blends with the whisper of cypress trees swaying under a deep blue sky. Somewhere nearby, a window creaks open, and the smell of warm bread and ripe figs fills the air. As the sun sinks low over the hills, time slows, and you begin to drift into the heart of a Tuscan summer. The artist's canvas. A solitary painter discovers beauty in every golden hour. The morning light filtered through the weathered shutters of Villa Serenata like honey poured through muslin, casting geometric patterns across the terracotta floor where Elena had arranged her easel the night before. She had been in this corner of Tuscany for 3 weeks now, having fled the noise and urgency of Milan for something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps peace, perhaps inspiration, perhaps simply the luxury of time moving at the pace of shadows across stone. Her bare feet found the cool tiles as she padded to the kitchen, where yesterday's bread sat wrapped in linen beside a bowl of figs that had ripened overnight, their skins split with sweetness. The coffee pot gurgled its familiar morning song as she prepared her ritual. Strong espresso in a small white cup, still warm bread torn by hand, and the first fig of the day eaten standing at the window that looked out over the valley. From here, she could see the olive groves stretching like silver-green waves toward the distant hills, their ancient trunks twisted into sculptures that time had carved with infinite patience. The morning mist clung to the hollows between the trees, dissipating slowly as the sun climbed higher, revealing patches of wild rosemary and lavender that released their fragrance into the warming air. Elena carried her coffee to the small balcony where her easel waited, already positioned to catch the light that would, in a few hours, transform the landscape into something transcendent. But for now, in these early moments, she simply sat and breathed, letting the stillness settle into her bones like water soaking into dry earth. The village bells chimed 7, their bronze voices carrying across the valley with a clarity that spoke of centuries of practice, of the same notes ringing out over the same stones since her grandmother's grandmother was young. Somewhere a rooster called, and she heard the distant bleating of goats being led to pasture, sounds that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than from any human endeavor. She began with the sky, always the sky, mixing cerulean and titanium white on her palette until she found that particular shade of Italian morning. Not quite blue, not quite lavender, but something in between that changed even as she looked at it. The brush moved across the canvas with the same rhythm as her breathing, slow and steady, each stroke a meditation on light and color and the way the world reveals itself to those patient enough to watch. By 9, the light had shifted, and she followed it with her brush, capturing the way it caught the edges of the cypress trees that stood like dark exclamation points against the brightening sky. A small lizard had claimed the corner of her balcony, sunning itself on the warm stone with the confidence of ownership, occasionally flicking its tiny tongue to taste the air. The hours passed unmarked except by the sun's journey across the heavens. Elena painted the olive groves as they emerged from shadow, each leaf catching and releasing light like a silver coin tossed in celebration. She painted the villa's garden where roses climbed an old stone wall, their petals dropping onto the gravel path like confetti from some long-ago celebration that continued still in the memory of the stones. Around noon, when the heat began to press down like a warm blanket, she retreated inside for lunch. More figs, this time with fresh ricotta from the village, and a glass of water so cold it made her teeth ache. The siesta called to her, as it did every day, that delicious drowsiness that seemed to rise from the earth itself during the hottest hours. She lay on the cool sheets of her bed, the windows thrown open to catch any wandering breeze, and listened to the sounds of the countryside settling into its midday rest. Even the insects seemed to quiet, as if by mutual agreement that these hours were meant for dreams. The distant hills shimmered in the heat, becoming insubstantial, more idea than landscape, and she drifted on the edge of sleep, her painter's eye still cataloguing colors. The deep shadow purple beneath the olive trees, the way the light turned golden as it filtered through their leaves. When she woke, the light had changed again, deeper now, more amber, with that quality unique to Italian afternoons that seemed to pour honey over everything it touched. This was the light she had come here to capture, the light that made even the most ordinary things, a weathered door, a tumble of stones, a single wildflower growing in a crack in the wall, look as though they held secrets worth keeping. She returned to her easel with renewed energy, adding layers to the morning's work, building up the textures of bark and stone and the soft dust of the road that wound between the hills. A butterfly landed on her palette, its wings the exact shade of Naples yellow she had just mixed, and she held perfectly still until it flew away, as if it had approved of her color choice and moved on to other concerns. The afternoon stretched like a cat in the sun, luxurious and unhurried. Elena painted the way the shadows grew longer, reaching across the valley like fingers searching for something just out of reach. She painted the first hints of evening in the sky, that subtle shift from day blue to something warmer, more forgiving. At 5, she heard the sound of a Vespa climbing the hill, its engine puttering with mechanical contentment. It was Signora Benedetti from the village, bringing fresh eggs and vegetables as she did twice a week, her basket carefully balanced on the back of her ancient scooter. They exchanged pleasantries in Elena's improving Italian, discussing the weather, the olive harvest that would come in the fall, the small dramas of village life that seemed both intensely important and utterly inconsequential. After Signora Benedetti departed in a cloud of two-stroke smoke and waving hands, Elena prepared a simple dinner, pasta with olive oil and herbs from the garden, a salad of tomatoes still warm from the sun, a glass of the local wine that tasted of the earth it came from. She ate on the balcony as the sun began its descent toward the hills, painting the sky in shades she would spend the next morning trying to recreate. The evening light transformed her work, revealing colors she hadn't realized she'd captured, showing her things about her own painting that daylight had hidden. This was the magic hour, when the ordinary world became something else entirely, when the cypress trees turned into dark flames against the golden sky, when the olive groves became a sea of silver and green that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. She set aside her brush as the first bats began their evening hunt, darting between the trees with impossible grace. The church bells chimed 7, then 8, marking time in their ancient way as the sun settled lower, painting everything in shades of amber and rose and deep warm gold. As darkness finally claimed the valley, Elena remained on her balcony, surrounded by the sounds of the Italian night. Crickets beginning their chorus, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft rustle of wind through the olive leaves. Her painting sat on the easel beside her, still wet, still alive with the day's light captured in pigment and oil. Tomorrow she would begin again, another canvas, another day of light and shadow and the endless, peaceful work of trying to catch beauty in a net of color. But for now, She was content to sit in the warm darkness, breathing in the scent of jasmine and rosemary, listening to the night sounds of a landscape that had been teaching artists about light for thousands of years. The stars emerged one by one, as they had for countless generations before her, as they would for countless more to come. Elena closed her eyes and let the peace of the Italian countryside settle around her like a blessing, knowing that tomorrow would bring new light, new colors, new moments of perfect, unhurried beauty to capture on canvas and hold forever. The Villa Guest. A traveler discovers the rhythm of Italian summer days. Marco arrived at Villa Dolce Vista on a Tuesday in July, when the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat and the promise of long, lazy days stretching ahead like a cat in afternoon sunlight. He had booked the small guest cottage sight unseen, drawn only by the photographs online and a description that mentioned peace, authentic Italian countryside, and the art of slow living, phrases that had called to something deep in his travel-weary soul. The taxi from the station wound up increasingly narrow roads, past stone walls draped with wild grapevines, past fields where sunflowers turned their heavy heads to follow the sun's arc across the brilliant blue sky. When they finally stopped before a pair of weathered wooden gates, Marco felt as though he had been delivered not just to a destination, but to a different century entirely. Signora Rossi emerged from the main villa like a figure from a Renaissance painting, her silver hair pinned back with casual elegance, her dress the color of sage growing wild in the herb garden. She welcomed him in accented English peppered with Italian phrases that seemed to make everything sound more beautiful, more important, more worthy of attention. "Benvenuto," she said, clasping his hands in both of hers. "Welcome to paradise, no? You are tired from the journey, yes? Come, come. We show you to your cottage, and then you rest. In Italia, we always rest first, then we live." The cottage sat at the edge of the property, surrounded by olive trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the afternoon breeze. It was small and perfect, with thick stone walls that kept the interior blissfully cool, windows that opened onto views of rolling hills that seemed painted by some master's hand, and a small terrace where morning coffee could be taken while watching the world wake up in layers of gold and green and blue. Marco set down his single suitcase. He had learned to travel light, to carry only what was essential, and stepped onto the terrace. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of church bells and the lazy drone of bees working the lavender that grew wild along the stone walls. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it, not just quiet, but the particular quality of Italian quiet, which seemed less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of peace. That first evening, Signora Rossi invited him to dine with her family on the main villa's terrace, a meal that began at sunset and continued long into the night under strings of lights that had been wound around the pergola with the casual artistry of people who understood that beauty should look effortless. There was no menu, no choices to make. Food simply appeared, course after course of perfection, bruschetta topped with tomatoes that tasted like concentrated sunshine, pasta that had been made that afternoon by Signora Rossi's daughter, olive oil so green and peppery it made his eyes water with joy. "In my family," Signora Rossi explained as she filled his glass with wine from their own vines, "we believe food is love made visible, yes? Every meal is a celebration. Every bite is gratitude." The wine was unlike anything Marco had tasted, rough and honest, speaking of the particular soil it came from, the particular hands that had tended the vines, the particular weather that had blessed or challenged each vintage. As the evening progressed and more neighbors appeared as if by magic, drawn by the sound of laughter and the promise of good food, Marco began to understand that he hadn't just rented a cottage. He had been adopted, however temporarily, into a way of life that moved at the speed of seasons rather than schedules. The next morning, he woke not to an alarm, but to the sound of roosters calling across the valley and the gentle lowing of cattle being led to pasture. The sun was already painting the hills in shades of gold and rose, and he realized he had slept more deeply than he had in months, as if the Italian earth itself had reached up through the stone floors to claim his restlessness and transform it into peace. Breakfast appeared as if by magic on his terrace. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, jam made from cherries that grew in the villa's orchard, coffee so perfectly prepared it seemed less like a beverage and more like a blessing. A note from Signora Rossi, written in her careful English, suggested he explore the village market, which convened every Thursday morning in the square beside the ancient church. The walk to the village took him down a road that had probably been old when Dante was young, past stone walls that had witnessed centuries of summers just like this one. Wild herbs grew in the cracks between the stones. Rosemary and thyme and something that smelled like heaven had distilled its essence into a single plant. Butterflies danced among the wildflowers, and lizards sunned themselves on the warm stone with the patience of creatures who understood that time was meant to be savored, not consumed. The village was a collection of honey-colored buildings clustered around a square, where a fountain had been playing the same song for 500 years. The market was already in full swing when Marco arrived, vendors arranging their offerings with the care of artists preparing an exhibition, tomatoes that ranged from deep red to golden yellow to striped green and purple, peaches so ripe their scent carried on the morning air, herbs bundled with string and labeled in handwriting that looked like poetry. Marco moved through the market slowly, buying things not because he needed them, but because they were beautiful. A handful of figs, a small jar of honey the color of amber, bread that would be perfect for tonight's dinner on his terrace. The vendors treated him with the gentle patience reserved for tourists who showed proper respect for their offerings, helping him choose the ripest fruit, the best cheese, sharing stories about their farms and their families in the comfortable mixture of Italian and English and gesture that served as the market's universal language. He spent the morning drinking coffee at the small cafe that occupied one corner of the square, watching the rhythm of village life unfold around him like a play he was privileged to observe. Children chased each other between the market stalls while their mothers examined vegetables with the seriousness of art critics. Old men gathered around a table for their daily card game, their voices rising and falling in animated discussion of politics and weather and the eternal mysteries of women. A priest walked by, nodding to everyone with the familiarity of a man who had baptized half the village and buried the other half, who knew every secret and kept them all with equal discretion. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Marco would wake with the sun, take his breakfast on the terrace while the world painted itself in morning colors, then set out to explore another corner of this landscape that seemed designed by nature herself to soothe the human soul. He discovered the lake hidden in a fold between two hills, its water so clear he could see ancient stones on the bottom, worn smooth by centuries of current and time. He found the abandoned monastery that crowned a nearby hill, its roofless chapel still holding the echo of centuries of prayer, its walls covered with wild roses that perfumed the air with their ancient sweetness. In the afternoons, when the heat made exploration inadvisable, he learned the art of the siesta, that beautiful Italian custom that acknowledged the wisdom of surrendering to the sun's power rather than fighting it. He would retreat to his cottage, lie on the cool sheets with the windows thrown open to catch any wandering breeze, and drift into the particular sleep that comes only in the heat of summer, populated by dreams of cypress trees and golden light and the taste of wine made from grapes that had been kissed by this same sun. Evenings were for the terrace, for simple meals prepared from the day's discoveries at the market, for watching the sun perform its nightly masterpiece as it settled behind the hills in a symphony of gold and rose and deep, warm purple. Sometimes Signora Rossi would appear with a bottle of wine and stories of the villa's history. How it had been in her family for 6 generations, how it had hidden partisans during the war, how it had always been a place where people came to remember what really mattered. "You see," she would say, gesturing toward the view that never failed to take his breath away, "in Italia we understand that life is not about the doing, is about the being. You cannot rush the olive to give oil, you cannot hurry the grape to become wine. Everything has its season, its time, its proper rhythm. This is what the old stones teach us, yes? Patience, acceptance, the beauty of letting things become what they are meant to become." As his stay entered its 2nd week, Marco began to feel changes in himself, so subtle they might have been imagined except for how profoundly real they felt. His shoulders, which had carried months of tension like a personal burden, began to relax. His breathing, which had been shallow and hurried for so long he had forgotten what full breaths felt like, deepened into something that reached all the way to his toes. Most remarkably, the constant mental chatter that had been his unwelcome companion for years, the endless planning and worrying and analyzing that had made peace impossible, began to quiet, replaced by something that could only be called presence. He found himself noticing things he would have walked past in his former life. The way morning light caught dewdrops on spider webs, transforming them into jewelry fit for queens. The particular shade of blue that appeared in the sky just before sunset, lasting only minutes but somehow containing all the peace in the world. The sound wind made as it moved through olive leaves, different from the sound it made in cypress or pine. A language he was beginning to understand without translation. One evening, as he sat on his terrace with a glass of wine and a simple dinner of bread and cheese and tomatoes that tasted like summer itself, Marco realized he had stopped counting days. Time had become irrelevant, replaced by the natural rhythm of light and shadow, of heat and coolness, of the eternal cycle that had been turning since before there were people to notice it and would continue long after the last human had become dust. The realization brought not anxiety but relief. For the first time in memory, he was living not in the future or the past but in the exact moment that was unfolding around him, as complete and perfect as it would ever need to be. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Marco closed his eyes and breathed in the perfume of jasmine and night-blooming flowers, the sound of crickets beginning their evening chorus, the distant echo of laughter from the main villa where another family gathering was settling into its ancient rhythm. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new moments of perfect, unhurried beauty. But tonight, he was exactly where he belonged, held by the embrace of Italian summer, learning the art of being fully, completely, peacefully alive. Hearts in summer light. 2 souls discover love among the cypress trees. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in June, carried by the postman who navigated the narrow mountain roads on his ancient Vespa with the skill of someone who had been making this journey for 30 years. Sophia received it at the small pensione where she had been staying since her arrival 3 weeks earlier, drawn to this corner of Tuscany by a fellowship to study Renaissance frescoes in the abandoned churches that dotted the countryside like forgotten prayers. The letter was from David, the English graduate student she had met at the university library in Florence, their fingers accidentally touching as they both reached for the same rare manuscript about medieval pigments. They had spent the afternoon in that library sharing whispered conversations about art and history and the particular quality of light that seemed to exist nowhere else but Italy, and when she mentioned her summer fellowship, he had asked if he might write to her. Now, weeks later, his careful handwriting told her he had taken a position as caretaker for a villa not 20 kilometers from her own temporary home. "If you would welcome the company," he wrote in his formal, endearing way, "perhaps we might explore these hills together. I find myself quite overwhelmed by the beauty here, and would value a fellow appreciator of Renaissance mysteries to help me make sense of it all." Sophia smiled as she folded the letter, her heart performing a small dance she hadn't felt in years. She wrote back that same afternoon, suggesting they meet at the Church of San Lorenzo, whose walls still held fragments of frescoes that had somehow survived both time and neglect, their colors still vibrant after 5 centuries of summers just like this one. They met on a Saturday morning when the air was already warm with promise, and the light had that particular golden quality that seemed to transform everything it touched into something worthy of worship. David arrived on a borrowed bicycle, his fair English skin already touched by the Italian sun, his eyes bright with the excitement of someone discovering that the world held more beauty than he had previously imagined possible. "You found it," Sophia said, gesturing toward the small church that sat on a hilltop surrounded by cypress trees and wild herbs that perfumed the morning air. "I've been practicing," he replied with a shy smile. "The villa's housekeeper, Signora Clementi, has been giving me directions in Italian, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand that dopo il cipresso grande means more than just after the big cypress. It means after the cypress that has been standing here since her great-grandfather was young." They unlocked the church together with the key Sophia had borrowed from the local priest, stepping into the cool dimness that still held echoes of centuries of prayer. The frescoes, though damaged by time and weather, still possessed a power that transcended their deteriorated state. Angels with faces worn smooth by moisture still seemed to hover in eternal flight. Saints with missing hands still gestured toward heavens painted in blues that no modern pigment could quite recreate. "Look at this," Sophia whispered, pointing to a section where the original sketch was still visible beneath the paint. "You can see where the artist changed his mind about the angel's expression. He started with something more severe, more judgmental, but softened it to something almost loving." David leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the soap he used, something clean and simple that seemed to belong to summer mornings and fresh cotton shirts dried in sunshine. "It's as if he learned something about mercy while he was painting," he said quietly. "As if the act of creation taught him something about creation itself." They spent the morning examining every inch of the surviving frescoes, sharing observations and theories, their voices hushed not just by the sacred space but by the intimacy of shared discovery. When the heat of midday finally drove them outside, they sat in the shade of the cypress trees and shared the lunch Sophia had packed, bread and cheese and the first cherries of the season, sweet enough to make them both close their eyes in appreciation. "I had forgotten," David said after a while, "what it feels like to have time. In London, everything moves so quickly, so urgently. Here, it feels like the light itself is teaching me patience." Sophia nodded, understanding completely. "My grandmother used to say that Italy doesn't just give you beauty, it teaches you how to receive beauty, how to let it change you instead of just consuming it." Their meetings became a weekly ritual, then twice weekly, then simply whenever one of them discovered something that demanded sharing. David would appear at her pensione with news of a hidden fresco in a chapel she hadn't found yet, or Sophia would arrive at his villa with photographs of details that had revealed themselves in just the right light, and off they would go together into the countryside that seemed designed by some benevolent god specifically for the purpose of afternoon discoveries. They explored villages where time seemed to have stopped sometime during the Renaissance, where old women still made lace by hand in doorways framed by flowers, where the baker's grandson used the same wood-fired oven his great-grandfather had built with stones carried from the local quarry. They found lakes hidden in folds between hills, their waters so clear they could see ancient Roman stones on the bottom, and they would sit on the shores eating bread and olives and talking about art and history and the way the Italian light seemed to reveal truths that artificial illumination could never expose. As July deepened into August, their friendship deepened into something neither of them had expected, but both recognized with the certainty that comes only from perfect timing and perfect place. It began with small things. The way David would steady Sophia when she climbed scaffolding to examine a fresco up close, his hand lingering just a moment longer than necessary on her waist. The way Sophia would lean against his shoulder when they sat together watching sunsets paint the sky in colors that changed even as they watched, her hair carrying the scent of the rosemary that grew wild around every ancient ruin. The evening it happened, they had been exploring a monastery that crowned a hill like a benediction, its cloisters still intact, its gardens still tended by the single monk who remained to care for centuries of accumulated holiness. They had stayed later than usual, caught up in examining frescoes that had been protected from weather by the covered walkways, and when they finally emerged, the sun was already painting the world in shades of gold and rose that seemed too beautiful to be real. "We should head back," Sophia said, though neither of them moved toward their bicycles. "We should," David agreed, making no move to leave the terrace where they stood looking out over a landscape that seemed to stretch into infinity, all rolling hills and ancient olive groves and the distant sparkle of a lake that reflected the evening sky like a mirror forgotten by angels. Instead, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the light change minute by minute, the kind of silence that exists between people who have moved beyond the need to fill every moment with words. When David finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Sophia, these weeks here, they've been..." He paused, searching for words in a language that felt suddenly inadequate. "I feel as though I've been waiting my whole life for these afternoons with you, for this place, for the way you see things that I would never notice on my own." She turned to look at him, this gentle English scholar who had appeared in her Italian summer like a character from one of the Renaissance stories they spent their days uncovering. His face was serious, vulnerable in the way of someone offering something precious with no guarantee it would be accepted. "I know," she said simply, and watched relief flood his features like sunrise flooding a valley. "I know exactly what you mean." When he kissed her, it was with the same reverence he showed the ancient frescoes, as if she were something precious that had somehow survived centuries just to be discovered by him in this moment, in this place, with this particular quality of evening light blessing them both. She kissed him back with all the wordless gratitude she felt for this unexpected gift, this person who looked at art the way she did, who understood that beauty was not just something to be observed, but something to be absorbed, to be changed by. They rode back to her pensione through the gathering dusk, their bicycles weaving lazy patterns down roads that seemed designed for exactly this kind of unhurried happiness. The air was full of the scent of jasmine and night-blooming flowers, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were chiming the hour with the casual authority of bronze voices that had been marking time since before their grandparents were born. The weeks that followed took on a dreamlike quality, as if they were living inside one of the frescoes they studied, surrounded by colors more vivid than real life usually provided. They would meet at dawn to watch the light change on the facades of ancient churches, sharing coffee from a thermos and planning their day's explorations with the seriousness of archaeologists and the joy of children who had discovered that treasure maps were real. Their afternoons were spent in pursuit of beauty, examining frescoes that revealed new secrets in different light, picnicking in olive groves where the trees were older than the countries they had come from, swimming in lakes so perfectly positioned they seemed to have been placed there specifically for the refreshment of lovers drunk on summer and each other. Evenings found them on terraces or in gardens or beside fountains that had been playing the same songs for centuries, talking about everything and nothing while the Italian dusk performed its nightly miracle of transformation, turning the ordinary world into something that belonged in the background of a Renaissance masterpiece. "I don't want this to end," Sophia whispered one evening as they lay on a blanket beneath stars that seemed closer here than anywhere else, as if the Italian sky had decided to lower itself just enough to eavesdrop on their conversation. "It doesn't have to end," David replied, his voice full of quiet certainty. "Not really. We carry it with us. This light, this way of seeing, this feeling of having found something we didn't even know we were looking for." As August began to show the first subtle signs of preparing for autumn, a slight change in the quality of light, a whisper of coolness in the pre-dawn air, they began to make plans. David would return to London for the semester, Sophia to her graduate program in Rome, but they had learned something important about time during their Italian summer. That some things exist outside of schedules and seasons, that love discovered in the right place at the right moment becomes part of the landscape forever. On their last evening together, they climbed to the highest hill in the area to watch the sunset from a spot they had discovered weeks earlier, a place where ancient stones formed a natural amphitheater facing west, as if designed by some long-ago civilization for exactly this purpose, the worship of light. The sun settled toward the horizon with the dignity of a blessing being bestowed, painting the entire world in shades of gold and rose and deep, warm amber. The cypress trees stood like dark exclamation points against the glowing sky, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began their evening song, joining voices that had been singing together for centuries. "Whatever happens," David said as they watched the last light fade from the sky, "I will never forget this summer, this place, the way you taught me to see beauty I never would have noticed on my own." Sophia smiled, her heart full of the particular peace that comes from having received an unexpected gift and knowing, without doubt, that it will last forever. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had learned to trust in the timing of miracles. Italian summers have a way of lasting much longer than the calendar suggests. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they gathered their things and began the gentle descent toward the village lights that twinkled below like earthbound constellations, carrying with them the quiet joy of two souls who had found each other in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, surrounded by beauty that would remain part of them long after they had returned to the ordinary world. Letters from the heart of summer. Village life unfolds through loving observations. My dearest Anna, the church bells have just finished their morning song. 7 chimes that echo across the valley like bronze prayers rising to meet the day. I write to you now from my small balcony where the jasmine has finally bloomed, filling the air with a sweetness so profound it seems less like a scent and more like a blessing. You asked in your last letter what it is like to live here in Montecros, in this village that time seems to have forgotten, and I find myself struggling to capture in words what can only truly be understood by surrendering to its rhythm. It is Wednesday, the 23rd of July, and the morning light is painting the red-tiled roofs in shades of amber and gold that no photograph could ever capture. Signora Benedetti is already in her garden, tending to the tomatoes that will grace her family's table tonight, her movements unhurried and sure, following patterns learned from her mother, who learned them from her mother, back through generations of women who understood that cultivation is a form of prayer. The fountain in the piazza has been playing its same song for 500 years, Don Giuseppe tells me, though he admits with a smile that he has only been listening to it for 73 of those years, since he was a boy chasing his sisters through these same narrow streets that smell of baking bread and wild herbs growing in the cracks between ancient stones. This morning I walked the path to the cemetery, not from any morbid impulse, but because it sits on the highest hill and offers the most complete view of our little world. The graves here are tended with the same care as the vegetable gardens, decorated with fresh flowers and small offerings that speak of love that transcends the merely temporal. From there, I can see the entire valley spread below like a painting by one of the masters. Olive groves that shimmer silver in the morning light, vineyards arranged in perfect rows along the hillsides, farmhouses scattered like dice thrown by a generous hand. July 30th. Cora Anna. The heat has settled over us like a comfortable blanket, bringing with it the particular drowsiness of Italian summer that makes afternoon siestas not just advisable but essential. Even the cats, who rule this village with the casual authority of long-time residents, have claimed shady spots beneath the oleander bushes and refuse to move until evening brings relief. Yesterday was market day, and I arrived early to watch the vendors arrange their offerings with the care of artists preparing an exhibition. Giuseppe the cheesemaker displayed his wheels of pecorino like sculptures, each one labeled with the date it was made, the particular pasture where the sheep grazed, the phase of the moon under which it aged. His pride in his craft is evident in every gesture, every careful explanation he offers to customers who already know by heart the story of each cheese but listen anyway because some stories improve with repetition. The tourists come through in waves now, cameras at the ready, searching for the authentic Italy they have seen in films and magazines. They move through our piazza like actors who have forgotten their lines, photographing everything and seeing nothing, missing the real performance that happens in the spaces between the obvious attractions. They snap pictures of Signora Moretta's cat sleeping in the afternoon sun, but miss the way she saves kitchen scraps for the stray that appears each evening at the same time, too proud to beg but too hungry to leave. But there are others, visitors who arrive with something different in their eyes, a willingness to be changed rather than simply entertained. These are the ones who linger at the cafe, who attempt conversations in broken Italian that inevitably dissolve into laughter and gestures, who understand that the true gift of this place is not what you can capture with a camera, but what you can only receive by slowing down enough to let it seep into your bones. I watched one such couple yesterday evening, young people who had arrived looking slightly lost, but who, over the course of an hour spent at a table beneath the ancient oak, began to mirror the rhythm of the place around them. Their voices grew softer, their movements less hurried, their attention more focused on each other, and the simple miracle of wine and bread and the way sunset transformed even the most ordinary buildings into something worthy of devotion. August 6th. Beloved friend, the grapes are beginning to show the first blush of ripening, and there is a feeling in the air that September is gathering itself somewhere just beyond the horizon, preparing for its grand entrance. But for now, we are still deep in the heart of summer, when each day feels eternal and identical to every perfect day that has ever existed. This morning I helped Signora Rossi with her herb garden, learning from her which plants prefer the morning sun and which must be protected from the afternoon heat. Her hands, gnarled with age but still sure in their movements, showed me how to pinch the basil to encourage growth, how to recognize when the rosemary is ready for cutting, how to dry lavender so it retains both its color and its perfume through the winter months. Every plant, she told me as we worked side by side in the cool morning air, has its own personality, its own needs, its own gifts to offer. The secret is not to force them to be what they are not, but to help them become fully what they already are. I think of her words often as I observe the rhythms of life here, how each person seems to have found their proper place in the larger symphony of daily existence. There is Marco, who delivers bread each morning on his bicycle, whistling melodies that seem to harmonize with the church bells. There is Lucia, who tends the small shrine at the crossroads, keeping fresh flowers before the statue of the Madonna with the devotion of someone maintaining a conversation that has been ongoing for decades. The afternoon storms have begun, those sudden theatrical displays that transform the sky into a canvas of dramatic grays and purples before releasing rain that falls with such intensity it seems less like weather and more like a cleansing ritual. Yesterday's storm caught me in the piazza, and I took shelter with a dozen others beneath the loggia of the old palace, strangers becoming temporary family as we watched nature perform its daily miracle of renewal. When the rain stopped, as suddenly as it had begun, the whole world seemed washed clean and glowing. Steam rose from the ancient stones, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and growing things, and the light that followed had a quality I can only describe as grateful, as if the sun itself appreciated the brief respite and was returning with renewed enthusiasm for its work of beautification. August 15th, Ferragosto. Dearest Anna, today is the Feast of the Assumption, and the entire village has transformed itself into something from a medieval painting. Flowers have been scattered along the route of the procession, their petals forming a carpet of rose and white and yellow that seems too beautiful to walk upon. The statue of the Madonna, crowned with flowers from every garden in the village, moves slowly through streets that have witnessed this same ceremony for 800 years. The children, dressed in their finest clothes despite the heat, carry baskets of rose petals that they scatter with the solemnity of young priests participating in mysteries they feel but do not yet fully understand. Behind them walk the women of the village, their voices rising in songs that have been passed down through generations, each note carrying the weight of countless summers, countless celebrations, countless moments of collective gratitude. I found myself thinking of you during the procession, wishing you could witness this living connection to the past, this casual assumption that the sacred and the everyday are not separate things but different aspects of the same eternal truth. Here, the act of making bread is as much a spiritual practice as attending Mass, the tending of vines as much an act of faith as lighting candles before saints. This evening, after the formal ceremonies ended, the real celebration began. Long tables appeared in the piazza as if by magic, laden with dishes that represented the best efforts of every kitchen in the village. There was no menu, no organization beyond the understanding that abundance shared is abundance multiplied. Children ran between the tables while their parents lingered over wine and conversation that would continue long past midnight, voices rising and falling in the comfortable chaos of people who have known each other's stories since birth. I was invited to join the table of Signora Benedetti's family, welcomed with the casual warmth reserved for neighbors rather than strangers, and I spent the evening learning the intricate relationships that bind this community together. Here, everyone is someone's cousin or godchild or the descendant of someone who once did a great favor for someone else's great-grandfather. The stories weave together like threads in an ancient tapestry, creating a picture of continuity that makes the troubles of the larger world seem both distant and somehow less important. August 25th. My dear friend, the light has begun to change, subtly but unmistakably, carrying in it the first whispers of autumn's approach. The mornings are still warm, the afternoons still languid with heat, but there is something in the quality of evening that speaks of seasons turning, of the great wheel of time preparing to carry us forward into new phases of beauty. The grape harvest will begin soon, and already there is a sense of anticipation in the air, conversations that turn inevitably to predictions about this year's vintage, assessments of rain and sun and the mysterious alchemy that transforms fruit into wine. Yesterday I joined a group of villagers examining the vines on the hillside above the church, listening to debates about timing that carried the weight of decisions that would influence not just this year's celebrations but the memories being created for decades to come. Wine, Don Giuseppe told me as we stood among the heavy clusters of grapes, is really time made tangible. When we open a bottle from this harvest 20 years from now, we will taste not just the grapes but this summer, this light, this particular combination of rain and sun and human hope that will never exist in exactly this way again. I have been helping Signora Rossi preserve the abundance of her garden. Tomatoes that will carry the memory of summer sunshine through the winter months, herbs that will perfume soups when snow covers the hills, jams made from fruits that seem to contain all the sweetness the earth can produce. There is something deeply satisfying about this work, this preparation for the future that acknowledges both the necessity of change and the possibility of continuity. The tourists are fewer now, those who come drawn more by genuine curiosity than by the promise of Instagram-worthy photographs. September 3rd. Cora Anna. The harvest has begun, and the village has transformed itself once again, this time into something from a Renaissance painting celebrating the fruits of human labor in partnership with divine providence. The vineyards that were green and silver just weeks ago are now heavy with purple clusters that seem to glow with their own inner light, and the air carries the sweet, slightly fermented scent of grapes so ripe they burst with their own abundance. I joined the harvest yesterday, my soft hands quickly learning the rhythm of cutting and gathering that comes as naturally to the others as breathing. There is something profoundly satisfying about this work, this partnership between human intention and natural generosity that results in baskets overflowing with the raw material of celebration. The work is hard but joyful, punctuated by songs that seem to rise spontaneously from the earth itself, by shared meals eaten in the shade of ancient olive trees, by the kind of laughter that comes from people engaged in work they understand to be meaningful. Even the children participate, their small hands perfect for reaching the clusters that grow close to the ground, their excitement infectious as they discover the magic of abundance that seems to multiply rather than diminish when shared. In the evenings, when the day's harvest has been delivered to the press, the village takes on a festive air that needs no formal declaration. Impromptu gatherings form around tables that appear as if by magic, laden with food that celebrates not just the grape harvest but the tomatoes and peppers and herbs that have also reached their moment of perfect ripeness. September 12th. My beloved friend. The pressing is finished, and the new wine sleeps in barrels that have held the dreams of countless previous harvests. There is a sense of completion in the air, of a cycle fulfilled, of time measured not in calendar pages, but in the eternal rhythm of planting and tending and gathering that connects us to every generation that has ever called this place home. The light continues its subtle transformation, taking on that golden quality unique to September that seems to bless everything it touches with a gentle nostalgia. The mornings are cooler now, perfect for walking the paths that wind between the vineyards and olive groves, for discovering corners of beauty that summer's heat had made inaccessible. I have been spending more time in the small chapel that sits on the hill above the village, not from any sudden religious conversion, but because the silence there seems perfect for reflection, for processing the gifts this summer has brought. The frescoes, damaged by time and weather, still retain enough of their original power to suggest transcendence, to hint at mysteries that exist just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. Yesterday evening, as I sat in that chapel watching the sun set through windows that have framed this same view for 700 years, I found myself overwhelmed with gratitude for this place that has taught me so much about the art of paying attention, for these people who have welcomed me with such generous hearts, for you, dear friend, who encouraged me to accept this opportunity when I was afraid it might be too much change, too much solitude, too much silence. But I have learned that solitude and silence are not the same thing as loneliness, that being alone in a place where you belong is completely different from being alone in a place where you are a stranger. Here, I am part of something larger, the daily rhythm of bells and bread and tending, the seasonal cycle of planting and harvest, the eternal conversation between human hope and natural abundance that has been continuing since the first person looked at this landscape and decided to make it home. September 18th. Dearest Anna, my time here is drawing to a close, and I find myself torn between eagerness to see you again and reluctance to leave this place that has become so much more than a temporary residence. It has become a teacher, a healer, a reminder of what life can be when lived in harmony with rhythms larger than our individual desires and fears. This morning I walked through the village one more time, trying to memorize details I know I will want to recall during the busy months ahead. The way morning light catches the edges of the old stones, transforming them into something that seems carved from solidified sunshine. The sound the fountain makes as it plays its ancient song, a music that has provided the soundtrack for countless lives, countless loves, countless moments of ordinary magic. I stopped to say goodbye to Signora Rossi, who pressed into my hands a small jar of honey from her own bees, amber-colored sweetness that will carry the essence of this summer back to my other life. For when you need to remember, she said with the practical kindness that has characterized all our interactions, that sweetness exists in the world, even when winter makes it hard to believe. The gift reduced me to tears, not of sadness exactly, but of recognition. Recognition that I have been changed by this place and these people in ways I am only beginning to understand, that I am returning to my ordinary life carrying something precious and fragile that will require careful tending if it is to survive the transition. Tonight I will pack my few belongings, preparing for tomorrow's journey back to the world of schedules and obligations and the thousand small urgencies that had once seemed so important. But I am not the same person who arrived here 3 months ago, overwhelmed by work and worry and the feeling that life was something that happened to me rather than something I actively participated in creating. This place has taught me that attention is a form of prayer, that the simple act of noticing beauty is itself a way of honoring the mysterious forces that create and sustain beauty. It has shown me that community is not just something that happens when people live near each other, but something that must be consciously created and maintained through countless small acts of care and consideration. Most importantly, it has reminded me that time is not a river carrying us helplessly towards some unknown destination, but an ocean in which we can choose to swim or float or dive deep, depending on our willingness to trust in currents larger and more ancient than our individual understanding. As I write these words, the church bells are chiming 9 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across the valley with the same authority they have claimed for centuries. Somewhere a nightingale is singing, adding its voice to the eternal conversation between earth and sky, between human longing and divine abundance, between the temporary and the eternal that find their perfect harmony in places like this, in moments like this, in letters like this that try to capture what can only truly be known through direct experience. I will write again when I reach home, dear friend, and begin the work of translating these gifts into daily practice. Until then, know that you are carried in my heart along with the memory of jasmine-scented mornings and the sound of fountains singing their ancient songs and the taste of honey that holds within it all the sweetness of a perfect Italian summer. With all my love and gratitude, Isabella. Grandmother's Kitchen. A chef returns to childhood flavors and memories. The key turned in the lock with the same slight resistance Luca remembered from childhood, when he would arrive each summer to spend the long, golden months with Nonna Giulia in the house that sat like a gentle blessing among the olive groves of southern Tuscany. The door opened onto the same cool darkness he had known as a boy, the same smell of old wood and lavender and something indefinable that he now recognized as the accumulated essence of decades of patient living. But now the house was his, left to him in a will that had surprised no one who knew how Nonna Giulia had doted on the grandson who shared her passion for the alchemy of cooking, who had spent those childhood summers at her side learning that food was not merely sustenance, but a language capable of expressing everything the heart might wish to say but could never find adequate words for. Luca set down his single suitcase and walked slowly through rooms that held 30 years of memories like pressed flowers between the pages of a beloved book. Here was the sitting room where Nana would shell peas on summer afternoons, her fingers moving with the efficiency of someone who had performed this task 10,000 times, while her voice wove stories of the village as it had been when she was young, when his grandfather still walked these floors, when the world moved at the pace of seasons rather than the frantic urgency that had consumed Luca's life in Milan. The kitchen drew him like a magnet, this room that had been the true heart of the house, where he had learned his first lessons in the art that would eventually make him famous in restaurants whose names appeared in guidebooks and whose tables were booked months in advance. But fame, he had discovered, was not the same thing as satisfaction, and success had brought him everything except the simple joy he had felt as a boy, standing on a wooden stool beside this same stove, learning to make pasta with hands that knew by touch when the dough was exactly right. The late afternoon light streamed through windows that looked out over the garden where Nana had grown the herbs and vegetables that appeared in her cooking as if by magic. Basil that perfumed the air just by existing, tomatoes that seemed to contain all the sunshine of August in their red hearts, zucchini blossoms that would be stuffed with ricotta and fried until golden, their petals still holding morning dew when they reached the plate. Luca opened the wooden shutters, flooding the kitchen with light that revealed every detail he had carried in his memory like a talisman against the sterile efficiency of professional kitchens. The marble counter worn smooth by decades of rolling pins and kneading hands, the collection of copper pots that reflected the afternoon sun like burnished gold. The herbs still hanging in bundles from the rafters even though Nana had been gone for 6 months now. On the counter, covered by a linen cloth that smelled of lavender, he found a note in her careful handwriting, placed there by someone who had known he would eventually come home, would eventually need what this place had always offered: peace, purpose, and the patient art of creating beauty from simple ingredients. Caro Luca, the note began, if you are reading this, it means you have remembered what I always knew, that cooking is not about impressing strangers but about nourishing souls, beginning with your own. In the pantry you will find everything you need to remember who you were before the world convinced you to become someone else. Cook with love, eat with gratitude, and trust that the recipes will find their way back to your hands like songs you learned so well as a child that you could never truly forget them. The pantry was exactly as he remembered, shelves lined with jars of preserved tomatoes and peppers and olive oil so green it looked like liquid emeralds. There were dried beans in glass containers, their colors ranging from deep purple to speckled brown to the pale green of new leaves. Pasta hung in long curtains from wooden rods, made by hands that had understood there was no hurry, that the best things came to those who allowed time to work its quiet magic. Luca chose ingredients by instinct rather than plan. Eggs from the chickens that still scratched in the yard under the care of the neighbor who had been tending the place in his absence, flour from the local mill that ground grain the same way it had for 3 centuries, olive oil pressed from fruit that grew on trees planted by his great-grandfather's hands. He began with pasta, the foundation of so many memories, his hands remembering the rhythm without conscious thought. The well of flour on the marble surface, the eggs cracked into the center, the gradual incorporation of wet into dry until a rough dough formed. The kneading came naturally, a meditation his muscles remembered even though his mind had been focused elsewhere for years. As he worked, the kitchen filled with presence, not ghostly or supernatural, but the accumulated warmth of all the meals that had been prepared here, all the love that had been kneaded into dough and stirred into sauces and served at the wooden table that had hosted 3 generations of family celebrations and quiet Tuesday dinners that were celebrations in their own right. The pasta dough reached that perfect moment, silky and elastic, neither too dry nor too wet, and he set it aside to rest, covered with the same linen towel Nana had used, probably inherited from her own mother who had inherited it from hers, a lineage of women who understood that some things improved with age and patience. While the pasta rested, Luca explored the garden, reacquainting himself with plants that had survived the winter under someone else's care, but seemed to recognize him nonetheless. The basil reached toward his hands as if asking to be picked, and he obliged, gathering enough for the simple sauce that was forming in his mind. not the complex reductions and foam presentations that had made his reputation, but something his grandmother would recognize, would approve of, would have made herself on a summer evening when the tomatoes were perfect and the basil was singing with fragrance. The tomatoes hung heavy on vines that had been trained to grow against the sunny south wall, their red globes warm from the afternoon sun. He selected the ripest ones, their skins so thin they seemed to barely contain the liquid sunshine within, and carried them to the kitchen along with the basil and a handful of the tiny peppers that grew wild along the garden walls. The sauce began with olive oil warmed gently in the pan that had been seasoned by decades of use, its surface as smooth as silk. He added garlic sliced so thin it was almost transparent, cooking it just until it began to whisper in the oil, releasing its perfume into the kitchen air. The tomatoes went in next, crushed by hand so they released their juice in a rush of color and fragrance that immediately transported him to every summer of his childhood. As the sauce simmered, finding its own pace without hurry or intervention, Luca rolled the pasta paper thin, his hands guided by muscle memory and the particular quality of late afternoon light that had always been his favorite time for cooking. The sheets of dough draped over the wooden rods like silk scarves, drying just enough to hold their shape when cut. He had forgotten the meditative quality of this work, the way attention to simple tasks could quiet the mind's constant chatter, could return him to the present moment with its particular gifts. The smell of garlic and tomatoes mingling in the warm air, the sight of golden light streaming through windows that had framed this same view for 100 years, the feeling of dough becoming silk under patient hands. The water boiled in the same pot Nana had used, and he added salt until it tasted like the sea, then slipped the fresh pasta into its embrace. It would cook in moments, another thing his hands remembered, the exact moment when the texture was perfect, still with a hint of resistance but yielding to the bite. As the pasta cooked, he finished the sauce with torn basil leaves that released their perfume like incense, with a splash of the pasta water to bind everything together, with a final drizzle of olive oil that caught the light like liquid gold. This was cooking at its most elemental, not about technique or presentation, but about understanding the essential nature of each ingredient and allowing them to express themselves fully. He drained the pasta and tossed it with the sauce in the same bowl Nana had used for family dinners, watching the simple alchemy that transformed separate ingredients into something greater than the sum of their parts. The first taste brought tears to his eyes. Not because it was perfect, though it was, but because it was true, because it tasted like home and memory and all the summers when life had been simple enough to be contained in the preparation of a single, honest meal. Luca carried his bowl to the terrace where he had eaten countless meals as a child, where the view over the olive groves remained unchanged despite all the years that had passed. The sun was beginning its descent toward the hills, painting everything in that golden light that existed nowhere else but Italy, transforming even the most ordinary objects into something worthy of worship. As he ate, he felt something settling back into place inside him. Not just the pleasure of good food simply prepared, but a recognition of who he had been before ambition and acclaim had convinced him to complicate what was essentially simple. This was what he had lost in the professional kitchens with their pressure and performance, their focus on innovation rather than tradition, their emphasis on impressing rather than nourishing. The days that followed took on a rhythm as natural as breathing. Luca would wake with the sun, drawn to the kitchen by an instinct older than thought, and begin his days cooking with the reverence of someone performing a religious ritual. He made bread from the starter that had been maintained by neighbors, Its yeast culture descended from organisms that had been living in this valley for centuries, connecting him to every baker who had ever coaxed life from flour and water and time. He learned to read the garden like a calendar, understanding which vegetables were ready for harvest, which herbs had reached their peak potency, which fruits were approaching their moment of perfect ripeness. The cooking followed naturally from this reading, each meal a response to what the earth was offering on that particular day, in that particular moment. There were no menus here, no predetermined plans, only the ancient conversation between cook and ingredients that produced results that could never be exactly replicated because they depended on variables that changed with weather and season, and the particular alchemy of attention and intention that could not be measured or controlled. As August deepened, Luca began to invite the neighbors who had cared for his grandmother in her final years, who had maintained the property in his absence, who remembered him as a boy and welcomed him back as a man with the warmth reserved for family. These dinners began as expressions of gratitude, but evolved into something more precious, a return to the communal aspect of eating that he had forgotten in his years of solitary success. Signora Benedetti brought stories of his grandmother's final months, how she had spent her last summer preserving food for a grandson she knew would eventually need the comfort of familiar flavors. Signor Rossi contributed wine from grapes that had grown in soil adjacent to Nana's garden, their roots intertwined beneath the surface like the relationships that bound this community together across generations. The meals stretched long into the evening, conversation flowing like wine, laughter rising like steam from the dishes that appeared course after course. Not from any formal plan, but from the abundance that multiplied naturally when people gathered with open hearts around a table that had hosted such gatherings for decades. "Your Nana," Signora Benedetti told him one evening as they lingered over the last of the wine, "she always said you would come back when you were ready to remember that cooking is not about being the best chef, but about being the best version of yourself." As September approached and the first hints of autumn appeared in the quality of light, Luca began to understand that his time here was not just a respite from his other life, but a return to his true life, the one that had been waiting patiently for him to remember its location. The house that had been his grandmother's was becoming his own, not through ownership but through the deeper claim of belonging, of having found the place where his gifts were most fully expressed. On his last evening before making the decision that would change everything, Luca prepared the simplest meal he could imagine. Pasta with olive oil and garlic, a salad of greens from the garden, bread still warm from the oven. He ate alone on the terrace, watching the sun paint its nightly masterpiece across the sky, listening to the ancient voices of crickets and nightingales and the wind moving through olive leaves. The decision, when it came, felt less like choosing and more like surrendering to what had already been chosen for him. He would stay. He would trade the acclaim of Milan for the satisfaction of feeding people who knew his name because his grandmother had loved him, not because magazines had proclaimed his genius. He would learn again the art of cooking for nourishment rather than impression, of creating beauty that would be consumed and digested and transformed into the energy that sustained life itself. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Luca felt the deep peace that comes from alignment, from discovering that the life you have been seeking has been waiting all along in the place you started, ready to welcome you home with the patience of ancient stones and the promise of countless mornings yet to come, each one offering the simple miracle of beginning again. The night settled around him like a blessing, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of church bells marking time in their eternal way, and Luca knew that tomorrow he would wake in his true home, ready to begin the real work of his life. the patient, joyful, never-ending art of turning simple ingredients into expressions of love.